We want to talk a little bit about prenups and postnups because there is not enough talk about them in the media. And I don't know that people fully understand how they work and what they do necessarily. And also right now, there's a lot of focus on divorce season and January is supposed to be like divorce month and more people are filing for divorce, et cetera. Yeah, true. But I like to say it's prenup season because people getting married in spring and summer need to be getting their prenups done now. They should have been talking about it months ago, honestly, but definitely they have to get moving now if they haven't been, because the last thing you want to do is have a conversation about your prenup 2 weeks or a month before the wedding and the venue's already booked, the bridesmaids already bought their dresses and stuff, and everybody's committed to tickets for the destination wedding. And you've got all this additional pressure now on top of you, in addition to the stress of getting married, right? So we want to run down the difference between prenups and postnups. We want to talk about kind of pros and cons, also mention a little bit about what we call the poor man's prenup or poor person's prenup, give you an idea of how they work. So Rahul, why don't you talk first, if you would, about what a prenup is, and then I can talk about what postnups are in contrast.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a good tie-in because we just mentioned a little while earlier as well about Kevin Costner and his prenup and how we love prenups. So prenup, or a prenuptial agreement, also known as a premarital agreement, is essentially a contract between two parties who are contemplating a marriage. Purpose of it, it's not required by any means, but it's a good idea because the purpose of it is to essentially allow the two parties to rewrite how divorce laws in their jurisdiction would apply to them. It's a way to sort of contract out of what the standard go-to is for divorce and rather agree to a different set of standards or guidelines in the event that their marriage ends either through a divorce, a legal separation, however otherwise it might be. The goal of a prenup essentially is to distribute or divide assets and liabilities, making provisions for how property acquired during the marriage, before the marriage, etc., will be divided, providing for or discussing what happens with something like spousal maintenance, also known as alimony, providing for who pays for attorney's fees, things like that. Things you can't contract for in a prenup are if you have kids, what happens to the kids? Who gets custody? Who gets parenting time? You can even go so far as to suggest what we've called in previous episodes the quote-unquote poison pill, which is you challenge the prenup and you lose, you're paying everybody's attorney's fees. Costner divorce famously had that poison pill, which we've referenced previously as well. And I think it's a wonderful tool for parties who wish to resolve all their possible differences that may occur, or fights that they may get, or arguments that they may face before everything. So they go into the marriage knowing what the outcome is. So they're all basically in for the marriage and not in for what they may or may not get.
One thing that unfortunately we see more often than not is prenups may get challenged that don't have these poison pill provisions. In some states, they may not be enforceable, by the way.
Right.
Always talk to an experienced divorce lawyer in your jurisdiction to get advice on a prenup. And by the way, along those lines, we're not a fan of the real estate lawyer who will give you a prenup for $500 kind of thing. The problem is that person's just going to pull a form out and fill it in and tell you you've got a prenup. It may be binding, but it may be missing 50% of the stuff that you want to have included in there. And it also might not include the disclosures that you need in order to make it enforceable. The two weak spots of prenups typically, and this is certainly true for Illinois and probably true in the other states, but again, consult with an experienced divorce lawyer in your area. But the two weaknesses are a failure to disclose assets and liabilities, income and expenses. So, full disclosure of your financial situation. And the other thing that can happen is if there's evidence of undue duress. That's not just duress. So duress, people will say, well, I was under undue duress because I was getting married in a week. That in and of itself is not considered undue duress. There's all kinds of case law interpreting, and this is state by state, so it varies. But the idea is the pressure unfair or above and beyond? So is it unreasonable? Were you forced to sign it because there was some threat made or implicit threat or something that was serious? And what would a reasonable person think in that circumstance? So those are the two weak spots. One of the elements of duress is, or one way you can show is I was pressured. I didn't have a lawyer. They just told me to sign it and it's a day before the wedding. It has to be extreme though. It can't just be they told me to sign it or we're not getting married, because that's the consideration for the prenup. That's not a threat. That's a reality. So right. It's not enough pressure to say, well, they told me we wouldn't get married if they didn't sign it. That's the deal. That's how it works.
That's the point.
The thing that is true, though, in a lot of these cases, in divorce cases we run into, lawyers will sort of take a shot at challenging the prenup, even though they shouldn't, even though they really don't have a good leg to stand on. They will take a shot at it just to try to position and try to do better in the divorce case. They will, in my opinion, make a bogus run at the prenup when it doesn't warrant it. Unfortunately, people do get their day in in court and they can try to challenge it and have a court enter what's called a declaratory judgment to say that, yes, this prenup is valid and would be binding on this divorce case. Most of those efforts are in vain. Most prenups hold up. The thing we've said multiple times on the show, Costner's a perfect example of a prenup that the other lawyer took a run at it. They said it wasn't fair and stuff like that. And then Christine Baumgartner eventually made the calculation that I squeezed about as much juice out of this thing as I could by the child support number, as you said, couldn't get nailed down by the prenup under California law. Her lawyers kind of took advantage of that situation and squeezed as much child support as they could have. Now, you're on the flip side. If you're her lawyer, you're saying, look, we're just getting she's entitled to. Okay, that's fine. You would say those lawyers did the best they could to get the best thing for their client. Now, I see that. I understand that. And the custody visitation and stuff and child support issues were not determined. And those are kids with a very ultra high net worth background, and it's going to be expensive to raise them. So I understand the big child support numbers. They tried to litigate to get a better property settlement, even though she had a fixed $1.4 million deal baked into the prenup. And we read news reports, this is reportedly the case, that Costner threw her some additional money to make her go away and get the thing done and be done with the litigation. So in that sense, her lawyers did very well for her by trying to squeeze a little bit more out of that deal.
And absolutely. And we've always said, right, like there's a lot of critics for prenups and they say, oh, they don't work, yada, 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 don't get a prenup. I mean, we are very strong believers of prenups. It's sort of silly to say it this way, but there's a reason celebrities and ultra high net worth individuals, they get prenups because it works.
And people would say, well, if you say they work, in Costner's case, it didn't work. No, it did.
No, it worked well. It worked extremely well.
Yeah, it limited his exposure tremendously. He is a multi-hundred millionaire, and he ended up being out 1.4 plus million plus legal fees, whatever extra he gave her, plus the child support, which he's going to have to pay anyway. So he did very well and limited his risks. It worked beautifully.
For people to sort of visualize it, right? I always like to sort of explain it using some imagery. It's sort of like, think about it this way. You put someone in a jail cell, they'll run around. Put someone in a jail cell and then you shackle them. They'll still be able to move. They just can't run around anymore. So they'll still thrash a little bit. So that's what a prenup really is. It's like, yeah, you're still thrashing. Yeah. She can still thrash a little bit, make a little noise, but you're still shackled. And you can move in the fringes, but you're still tied down. And that's sort of what a prenup does. And that's kind of how it works.
A couple of common objections are, how do I broach this topic? How do I talk to my fiance about this? It's not romantic at all. First of all, if you have assets to protect and you're in a situation where they have a lot of assets and a lot of income and they're marrying somebody who is lesser means financially, or they're inheriting stuff from their family, or they're part of a family business, and the family tells the person, look, we can't expose all this stuff to your spouse. We love your fiance, but we can't afford to have half of the family business go to this person in the unfortunate event of a divorce. So people will seek these out. And admittedly, it's a difficult conversation, but it doesn't mean it's not important to have. It's a critical conversation to have. The other option is to not have one. And we'll talk about that in a minute, but for a lot of people, that's not an option. If somebody is unwilling to have that conversation and they're unwilling to talk to you about it or to agree to sign one, and you're a person who needs to protect those assets and income, you don't have any other choice. So that person's probably not the right person for you if they don't respect that. And
it doesn't have to be bad. We're not advocating for a one-sided prenup by any means.
Right.
We're just saying, have the conversation, determine what the two of you believe to be, I hate using this word, but fair to each of you, because what's fair to one person might not necessarily be fair to the other person. So determine what's fair two of you can agree to, and that's the prenup essentially. Right? It's not like saying, hey, you get nothing, I get everything, sign this or we're not getting married. It's not what we're saying. It's just have the discussion. You'll have it in the divorce, so you might as well have it now.
Yeah, both people are putting time and money at risk by getting married in a way. They're both exposed to risk. Mitigating both people's risks and finding where both of your circles of your Venn diagram overlap and where you can find that place that makes sense for both of you. It's just really good to have those conversations, and it's going to drive the value conversations that you need to have before the marriage anyway, about kids, money, your future, retirement, whatever, your vision of how the marriage should go. The prenup's going to drive some of the important parts of that conversation, the prenup conversation, and it's going to tell you a whole lot about where you stand in your relationship and how that relationship is going to look by having that conversation. Yes, it's uncomfortable, but it's critical. So there is no easy way to broach the topic. There's no magic words other than we need to talk about a prenuptial agreement. And, I think you'll find less resistance. There is an increasing prevalence of use of prenups. We're seeing in our business, in our law firm, STG Divorce Law, Chicago. We've read some stats, I think, on this show that There's an increasing acceptance of prenups. A lot of people are getting married later, so they both have some stuff to lose, and they're looking at that. One little caveat I want to make, and we'll end this part of the conversation is, and we'll move on. We have an actual case, or we had a divorce case where we represented the guy in this one, and they've been married a long time. And the wife, fiance, wanted the prenup. I think they were worried this guy was a mope, wasn't going to amount to much. He was a young dude, didn't really have much of a job. She was making good, back at the time, what was considered decent money, had a good job. She had a car. She had like a condo. And so they protected all this stuff in the prenup. They were married a long time. And our guy went from zero to hero. So this guy became successful and worked his ass off and started making a lot of money. He made lots and lots of money, as it turned out. The prenup was insisted upon by the wife's family. Then she wants a divorce, only to find out that they unearthed the prenup and it's got no maintenance. There's no alimony. Meanwhile, she's not working anymore or has a modest job making not a lot of money. And this guy's making huge amounts of money. And to give him credit, he was an absolute gentleman about this and gave her maintenance, even though he didn't have to. That is a cool move. It's the mother of his children. But his attitude was, I would be a total jerk forever if I didn't help the mom of my children. I'm here with millions of dollars, and here she is with not much, and she ends up holding the bag. So he didn't want to look himself in the mirror and see that's the kind of person he was. So he's a stand-up guy, and he took care of her, which was an awesome move on his part, but didn't have to happen. So that's one thing where I can say this, don't be super short-sighted in these prenups. Everybody always thinks about the worst case scenario when they're creating prenups, which is understandable. What people are worried about in a prenup is typically what happens if we're only married 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. I'm the one who brings all this money to the relationship and stuff, and it's my house and all this stuff. And then they want a divorce and I'm screwed. That's kind of what people think about. They don't really think about the 20-year scenario. What if we're married a long time? The whole set of circumstances can change, sometimes dramatically. And what might have seemed like a real smart deal is a very bad idea down the road. So just keep that stuff in mind when you're thinking of prenups and what you want in these agreements. There's a couple ways we think about this. I say that the classic prenup is the what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours, what's ours is ours. Here's the list of your stuff. Here's the list of my stuff. That's going to be our separate property when we get married. And during the marriage, the things we earn during the marriage are going to be joint, and that's going to be split in usually equally, but not always. And when we get divorced, and then maybe there's some provisions with support or maintenance and a couple other things. So that can be a challenge because there are other things you can do in a prenup. You can designate that the property defaults to separate property and isn't joint property unless you say so. And that's pretty popular too. People will say, well, if I buy something, it's mine. If you buy stuff with your money, it's yours. And we're basically keeping our money separate unless we put it in a pot together.
You have a lot of different permutations.
Yeah. So there are lots of options to talk with a lawyer about. Just understand, try to keep a big picture view of this whole thing when you're discussing this with a lawyer and with your future spouse. Understand what all the options are before you jump into these things, and just understand a simple prenup may not be the thing that's best for you in your situation because everybody's mileage varies.
Oh, it's very fact specific, like you said, and LegalZoom won't cut it typically. I'm not saying anything bad about LegalZoom. I'm just saying it might work for some people, it might not work for others. So you want to make sure you do your due diligence before you use an app if you don't do it all the way in, etc. So
in fact, we had a gentleman hire us who wanted us to review one created by one of the online sites. And we did. And there were several things we talked to him about that weren't in the agreement that he just hadn't considered because the app doesn't talk to you about all this stuff. It was a fine basic prenup, but it was missing several things that he could have added and things he hadn't thought about just because the app is not going to talk to you about all this stuff. So I imagine with AI and everything, these will improve, but it's cheap to talk to a lawyer about this. I think we charged him for an hour of our time to give him the initial review. That's several $100 worth of insurance. It's a bargain relative to the huge amounts of money that are on the line in a divorce case. Just like an estate plan is cheap insurance, buying a prenup is incredibly cheap insurance for a divorce case. It controls the landing, as you said. It restricts the list of potential outcomes from the universe down to a narrow set of outcomes. A prenup and a postnup are actually, they seem like they would be the same. Like, well, it's just a prenup, but it's after marriage, right? It's a postnup.
That's what everyone thinks.
A little bit of that is true in that the effect is similar to some extent. You're controlling the landing in a divorce case with a postnup, but there's a major difference, and that is prenups are not judged on their equitable or fairness at the time people are getting divorced. So that situation where the guy was then a multimillionaire in the case I explained, and she didn't have as much money, and the prenup would have allowed him to walk away with tons of money and no maintenance, that would have been binding. That prenup was legal and binding, even though someone would say, well, that's not fair. Well, it was fair at the time it was signed, which is the way it's looked at. When it was signed, was it equitable? Whereas in a postnup, it's evaluated, later on, and it's judged on its equity at the time of the divorce. And the problem problem with it is too, and the big difference is the consideration for a prenup is just the marriage. All you have to trade for the terms of the prenup is getting married. Your only option is to not get married. Well, in a postnup, it's very different because the divorce laws of the state where you're located, if you got divorced, provide the person with certain rights. And when they sign a postnup, they might be trading away some of those rights. For example, if they agreed to support that's less than the state law would provide, they're giving something up, or they're agreeing to be given assets later if in the event they get divorced. If they're agreeing to a lesser proportion than they might get in a divorce, you have to trade some fair value for that. And it's not enough to just say, well, we'll stay married in exchange for signing this postnup. By the way, the balance of power changes radically. The kids say these days, a person who's secured the bag, whoever's got the money holds a lot of power with the prenup, because if the other person doesn't sign, we're not getting married. Of course, that's how gutsy they are to not get married. It depends. But with a postnup, the other person is holding the power because they don't have to sign the postnup. There is no incentive other than the threat of the other person to go through with the divorce. It's a very interesting balance of power shift that happens with a postnup, and they are much more tricky than a prenup. You can't just go get a form one. It's just like negotiating a divorce marital settlement agreement. All the same work is involved in the discovery and all that kind of stuff, only you're not divorced yet. It's an agreement that will drop into place in the event of a divorce, with the added issue that's not in a prenup of governing what you do with finances while you're still married. So there are really two parts to a typical postnup. That is, how do we deal with things financially while we're married? What do we do if we get divorced? So there are major differences, and postnups are typically far more expensive than prenups because they're basically divorces without getting divorced.
So I've had some experience with postnups, absolutely. I've had a few where they wanted to sort of get this mini divorce done in a postnup world. And again, the conversation's a little different. Sometimes they come in and it's sort of like a postnup, sort of like not a postnup. They're like, hey, I'm going to buy this parcel of real estate. My wife and I have agreed that in the event of a divorce, she's going to waive any interest she has in this parcel of real estate, but everything else is still on the table. Can we get a contract written up for something like this? You have to craft it in a way which is legally sufficient and meets the standards of just a very narrow postnup for one issue. But beyond that, though, it's sort of one of those where you don't see too many of those. And typically, it's just that. If you're talking about a postnup, it's either because you feel like you're coming into money. And like you said, the person in a prenup who holds the bag or has secured the bag is the moneyed person. In a postnup, it's the other person. Don't get married thinking you can always enter into a postnup later, because it's totally different. You mentioned consideration, Rafe. What kind of consideration? Does that mean they write them a check, or do they make provision for the other side in a postnup? Like, how does that consideration work?
That's a great question, and I missed talking about that. Like we said, in a prenup, it's just getting married is enough. In a postnup, basically, if you put provisions in the agreement that are fair and balanced, that show a trade of value for whatever is in the deal. So basically the deal has to be equitable. And as long as it's equitable, that gives you some leeway. Then a court will agree with it and think it's valid and binding. They take different shapes and sizes. I did a very large one several years ago. This is someone with very large estate. In that case, the wife wanted control over half of the assets. Basically, she wanted a financial divorce. Ultimately, they agreed to stay married if they got a financial divorce. So in this case, it was interesting because they front-loaded the division of money. So they divided their assets, and they said, well, they divided a large chunk of them. So a third of the money went to her, a third of the assets went to him, and that was considered their separate property. And a third of the assets stayed in the marital pot, and they used that to pay their bills. They had an agreement that they would share their bills equally. And in the event of a divorce, the stuff in that middle pot, the stuff in the middle 1/3 would be split equally. They said 50-50 straight up. In my opinion, that was an equitable deal because they untangled their money and gave each other non-marital money. They kept in separate accounts, invested separately, and they left something in the middle. I've seen people do things like they almost do a full financial divorce where they untangle everything, but they stay married and they give one person 50%, one person the other 50%. And they do things like bring in that provision saying, well, there's no new marital property being created unless we agree. Our income is our own. Our assets and the growth of our assets is our own independently. There's a firewall between the two of them, even though they're married. So you can style it a number of different ways, but the key is it has to be balanced. And the court is looking for that equitable deal, that equitable division. That we say fair, but that's not the word the law uses. The word is equitable, which has a fairness component, and it sounds a lot like equal, but it's not necessarily equal either. So people will say, well, what about 50-50? Well, a lot of times, but not always. The big consideration is baked into the deal. And it can be in the form of handing money to somebody in the present, or it can be in the form of a future agreement to divide things, equitably in the future.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I think that's very, very good illustration of the difference between prenups and postnups. I think there are a lot of people, attorneys included, who don't know that difference.
Oh, yeah,
and I think that's where people get in trouble is that they think it's the same thing. It's just now you're married, now you're not. So
yeah, they just think, it's a hassle. This is a hard conversation. Let's wait till after we're married. Well, don't go to sleep on this thing, because you're going to be sorely disappointed that either the other person's going to pull the rug out from under you and say, yeah, I don't want to sign one. And now you're left. Your choice is get divorced or stay married with no agreement. We wanted to go through that in some details. So let us know if you have questions in the comments, by the way. We're happy to answer questions if we can. You can always consult with our firm, STG Divorce Law, stglawfirm.com. We're always happy to help. We're in Chicagoland. So stglawfirm.com, check it out. We have a free webinar that we're doing. We have a pro bono day coming up where we do free consultations for folks. Normally we charge for consultations. We've got a lot of free assets. Also, one other thing we have is a private Facebook group that's free to join, and we have almost 1,000 members. So we answer folks' questions there too. So check it out, please. And if you'd like to have a consultation, we're always happy to talk to you about whatever it is, prenups, postnups, divorce, if you're an Illinois resident in the Chicagoland area. If you need a referral outside of Chicagoland, we are happy to make that referral not only in Illinois, but all across the United States and in Canada. We have great lawyers we work with all over the country and in Canada too. So please keep that in mind. We're happy to help.